and thank you very much for joining us again at the Future Print Virtual Summit. I'm really pleased, actually, to be doing a slightly different session this afternoon with two very good guys from the other side of the Atlantic, which is always nice, although you could call the area they're from kind of middle of the Atlantic kind of thing. You're Boston-based, aren't you, or very near that? Yeah.
Pretty much.
Yeah, exactly. I've got two guys who are both analysts, and this session is known as the session that really starts to think about what the analysts think and look at some of the key trends that we see coming out of our situation at the moment. I'll just introduce you to both of them. I'll start with Tim Green, who some of you may know. He is a research director within IDC Hard Copy Solutions Group. He's a specialist in wide format and 3D, so we'll be looking forward to hearing some thoughts on that. And he's been in the industry quite a few years, so he's enough to work for the other organisation that Colin McMahon works for. And so I introduced Colin, and he is research analyst at Keypoint Intelligence, primarily supporting the business development services, and he is a graduate of Concordia University and a published author. Good afternoon to both of you, gentlemen.
Pleasure to be with you, Fraser.
Good afternoon.
Colin. Hi, Tim. So Colin's going to kick this off by sharing some slides with us and putting a little bit of context to some of the research that's out there and kind of looking at some of the kind of key trends and seeing how this relates very much to our print industry. So, Colin, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Fraser. Let me know when everything looks good and we'll get this started off.
Brilliant.
Okay.
Yep. So if you that's perfect.
Excellent. Okay. So obviously what we're talking about, the elephant in the room, taking up the room, crushing the room, COVID, the pandemic that's been going on for what feels like at least a decade, and how it is really changing things, impacting print, in this year, 2020, for the rest of this year and well beyond. So really, I think what we have to start our conversation around is the economic recovery and the picture of what that looks like. I said, months ago in the last Future Print that this is not going to be a quick turnaround. We're in this for the long haul. A vaccine must be developed and successfully dispersed, worldwide in order to ensure that economic recovery is sustained and long term. And even then, will we get back to fully where we were or the same market? I mean, if you look back at the 2008 recession, the print industry lost about 10% of all of its revenues. And that really never came back, or at least didn't come back the exact same way. New things came in and old things faded. And this time, we suspect we might see around double that in terms of permanent revenue loss in certain areas. Now, again, that doesn't mean that the industry is going to entirely shrink by 20%, because as we'll talk later, there'll be innovation and there'll be new product lines. But that is something to keep in mind and to think about. And even when the vaccine does come, the recovery will take longer. It will take longer for life to get back to normal, or as normal as it's going to look in a post-COVID world.
Sounds good. Okay. Tim, did you want to add anything to that from your own kind of research?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think nobody knows the exact pace, right? The pace of a vaccine, the pace of the recovery. Mm-hmm. I'll say this: I think it's unquestionable that we're seeing, some of the things that drive, particularly the areas that I focus on, large format and 3D printing, some of the things that drive that are unquestionably profoundly impacted, and that will delay recovery, right? So for best example is, the sheer number of locations within, small businesses, whether it's restaurants or retail stores, those places are closing. And some of them will not come back. I think that I saw a number here in Massachusetts where I live. It's like 25% or something of restaurants that have closed due to this virus are not coming back, are not going back in, coming back in business, maybe ever, right? So it is a huge number. It is a profound impact. I think Colin's right. Ideally there's a vaccine developed and things come on back. But I do think in some ways, certain retail establishments like trade shows, a lot of that stuff I think has been permanently impacted.
Yeah, yeah. I think clearly, I mean, obviously talking from the sort of wide format side, the POP, the retail space
For sure.
is particularly hard hit by this, and we can see that already, can't we?
Hmm.
Interesting. Colin, do you want to go to your next slide?
Of course. So when we looked at how the pandemic was going on, it's simple to say that everything was impacted, but it's also not fully accurate. Like, yes, every industry was affected by the pandemic. Life was affected by the pandemic, but it made a huge difference if you were, say, in the manufacturing space versus if you were primarily a print service provider for the hospitality and leisure market. Like, unfortunately, we've seen those players have been hit the hardest. If you were a company that, as Tim suggested, you produce signage for trade shows and other live events and all sorts of these things, and for resorts and vacations, well, it's hard times. It's very difficult. Likewise, education, which was actually initially impacted quite largely by the pandemic, has rebounded somewhat as school systems are adjusting and trying to figure out what they can and can't do, and actually to look at the technology and go into the future a little bit. I was actually reading the other day about how I think it's one university out in California is now commissioning science textbooks with augmented reality built into them so that the book can be the lab, which I think is a fantastic example of how print is innovating to be still relevant and still very needed in a remote workforce or remote, atmosphere.
Yeah.
But so yeah, it's just we're looking at a decline and we're looking at impact, but it's very varied by industry.
Sure. Tim alluded to that what you were saying a little earlier, weren't you? Do you sense, Tim, that there might be some marketplaces that are stronger? I mean, obviously, home delivery seems to be on the up, and therefore maybe you'd argue that corrugated packaging is doing quite well because of
Indeed, I think we have this. We have a product, industrial printer tracker Fraser, that does indicate yes, packaging is. A lot more of us are shopping online and not shopping in retail environments, right? And so, unquestionably, there is some changeover happening that is driving volume in the packaging business. So definitely, that there are bright spots. I think what Colin and I are both saying is that there, that all of this really stresses and I know you and your partner have talked about this many, many times, the concept of innovation, being innovative, mm-hmm. right? And, this really stresses that, right? So, we talk to shops who say some of them who've been able to say, you know what, yesterday I supported trade shows. Today I'm in the personal protective equipment business, right? And they have to apply their skills, their creativity, their know-how in terms of how to operate the equipment and then how to go sell that stuff to hospitals. And they have to be able to change the business model effectively overnight. And, at least within the past couple of months to support, whether it's, now I sell to hospitals, or now, maybe I had always done window signage for these retail stores, but now I better go get into the floor graphics business, or now I better, figure out a way to cut plexiglass so that we can get into more of a touchless transaction kind of environment. So innovation is the key here.
And on that same level, if I could just jump in, I feel that in addition to the industries being hit, what we've seen is with the people we talk to, those that had product diversification beforehand, those that were equipped to deal with many different areas, they're being impacted a lot less because they're able to shift and adjust. And it's like, as Tim was saying, if you're not doing window signs anymore, window graphics, you can at least do floor decals. Which unfortunately, that does mean that some of the print businesses hit the hardest are the smallest, and thus, the most able to, or they don't have the resources to invest, or they don't have the insight into what to do next, and they're just unfortunately kind of grasping at straws for what to do tomorrow when today's business suddenly stops working.
Do you think this, in a way, is a brutal way of cleaning up the industry a little bit?
It definitely has had that. Yeah, it will have a consolidating impact. Probably both, definitely short term and long term. Probably as these companies do. Sadly, some of them go under, and others have to, shrink or consolidate just to survive and keep the lights on for another year or two. Um, that said, there will also be expansion, as Tim was talking about. Like, it's time for innovation, and there will be. It's not always the biggest companies who innovate the best. Sometimes it is a smaller player, someone who's just in the right spot at the right time, who has that new insight, that kind of outsider insight that can identify an opportunity better. So while I would say overall, yes, a trend of consolidation and unfortunately market shrinkage, as like we kind of burn away some of the, I would hate to say like weaker plant life or whatever, but the plant life that's just not suited to survive in this environment that we're in. But I don't want to paint the picture as completely negative because, as I said, innovation comes from anywhere.
Another thing that happens, Fraser, and this happened back in 2008 too, is there were business down, companies closed, there's layoffs all through this economic recession, and in some cases the layoff or the fact that people are suddenly not working, I think it drives people to say, all right, I'm tired of this. I want to be my own boss, right? Yeah. And so they'll develop their own business. In some cases, it relates to our signage and graphics market, where people say, you know what, I'm gonna start printing signs. I'm gonna start doing my own thing, and they'll buy a printer and put it in the garage and start running it, and make a business from nothing into something that that they can sustain, and this is happening. And now maybe it won't be wide format the same way it was in 2008 because that market's changed for sure. But maybe it will be other things like DTG printing or specialty printing or DTG meaning direct to garment, right? So maybe it's a t-shirt printer, which are now suddenly much cheaper than they were back in 2008, right? So I do think there will be a kind of a new sort of, I'm going to say bottom of the market, but I just mean really, really small companies that will pop up now because they need to, and the owners have suddenly, time on their hands just because people aren't working the way they were.
Yeah, there's a couple of things in what you said there. There's that sort of idea that someone reinvents themselves, isn't there? That sort of reinvent because they can just see the writings on the wall. If you're a sign and graphic specialist in the event market, for example, that's a really tough space at the moment. There really is no business. I don't know in the US, but in Europe, and particularly in the UK, the market is just stopped, and it's going to probably get worse now as government starts to tighten up. So that event space is really tough if you're in that sign and graphic. But then the other side of that is, as you said, you might come out and do some, you might try and produce other things for other bits of marketplace.
Sure.
You might go away from the market and rethink completely differently. The question I just was going to ask you is, are the vendors, the manufacturers, helping the printers to perhaps evolve or shift or change? What do you sense, guys?
Well, this is Tim. I sure think they are. I mean, in very practical ways, and also in much more, I'd say, forward-looking ways, right? In practical ways, meaning like they'll say, we can defer payments on this equipment until it looks like business gets better, or something like that, right? And they can make deals with banks to facilitate that kind of activity, and hopefully that's happening and appreciated by the companies who are doing business. And that's probably something for bigger companies, not so much for small. Yeah. But also, I think in many cases saying like, look, is there ways to either subscribe to this equipment or do something different that they can facilitate? So in some cases, maybe it is, not so much signage and graphics, but it's decor business, right? Or maybe it's the garment business, which doesn't go away just because people are not shopping so much. It just means it goes from an e-commerce kind of sale versus a retail sale, right? So the market's definitely changing, and I think in many ways the manufacturers are trying to facilitate that.
Colin,
Yeah,
can you-
and to build on that, what we've seen, and we're actually we're testing a lot of software around this, is the manufacturers are releasing new solutions to make their devices easier to use remotely or
Yep.
just safely. We're touch free is a big thing right now, and all of that is it's part to where they're trying to give the print providers the tools they need to keep in business and to return to business as usual as soon as possible. So
Is there
yeah, I
anyone
mean that's been a huge area of investment.
Sorry, Colin. I just wondered whether that's an interesting one, what you just mentioned. Is there anyone specifically that you can say, this vendor I know is doing something?
Well, we just finished highlighting that both Konica Minolta and Canon have been pushing this very hard, and not just for devices that they're selling for the office space, but also in other areas as well. But yeah, HP has their own solution. All of the big manufacturers right now are trying to work on tools to automate, tools to streamline workflows, and tools to limit the actual. It's not just the human touch points of when do you need a person.
Okay.
Every touch point period of how much do you even need to touch this device.
Yeah, interesting. Would you like to go to your next slide? Because I think this starts to pick up on some of these issues.
Of course. So this is to go back to, if anyone saw the previous presentation I did for Future Print, we spoke a lot about Industry 4.0 and the fact that people have been talking about for years that we're kind of there, we're transitioning there. Some people are even now throwing out that we're going into Industry 5.0. I don't really hold with that. But what we are seeing is the arrival of kind of the true Industry 4.0 or the full transition into Industry 4.0. So that's moving forward with trends such as automation, sustainability, digital workflows, cybersecurity, decentralizing the workforce in a way that allows it to operate at higher levels of productivity, even without being together and putting all that data and information through a central hub.
Yep. Did you want to add anything to that, Tim?
Well, I mean, I think IDC's got a lot of irons in the fire here, but for sure, from my perspective, we definitely see a lot more, a lot of focus on some of the elements that are leading in this direction. Now, just do companies set out and say, like, is Industry 4.0, is that a destination for us? Mm-hmm. I think to me, it's kind of like, total quality management was at a time, and lean manufacturing is, in the sense that, it's a movement. It's a journey, right? You're never there because it always will be, a focus on more automation, thus reducing labor costs and more sustainability and resiliency and more digital workflow. And so I think it's definitely happening. For sure, from the 3D printing side of this, we see a lot of area of focus on smarter sourcing, localized manufacturing. More importantly, it's about flexibility and resiliency, and all of those are really important factors. And then connecting those to data, I'd say demand side data, that really helps companies predict what are customers going to want, when are they going to want it, where, and what's going to look like when it's done. And I think that this is sort of a longhand way of saying what Colin said about, is this Industry 4.0, or is it just is it the next step or a smarter way to produce?
Mm-hmm. I think that's interesting what you just mentioned there, which we don't hear an awful lot about, which is that management of data from the purpose of analyzing trend to be able to work out how to supply and how to produce. That is an interesting one.
Yeah, I really I think that's, ultimately that's where a lot of companies want to go, right? Whether it's if you think about it from my viewpoint, right? We think about 3D printing, we think about large format graphics. I think about digital signage too. Like, when I walk into a grocery store, right, it looks at me and says, there's a 50-year-old guy who loves chicken wings. Now, how do we promote chicken wings in this grocery store to make sure that this guy buys that, right? And so the idea of, understanding what demand is and having those products in location, but also not manufacturing or producing those until the guy's ready to buy something, right? Yeah. So think about like Amazon.com. Everyone wants to be Amazon in that sense, right? One of Amazon's set a great example for everyone to know, right? Think about like a friend of mine recently talked about Amazon and the book industry. If you think about it, they went from, look, we used to produce millions and millions and millions of books and then put them in the store and hope people bought them, right? Now, an Amazon flips that on its head and just says, we're not printing anything until someone places an order. We have your money. Now we'll make your book, right? And the same is true in many parts of manufacturing. When people say, like, what are we doing? You think about all these airplane parts that are taking up all these warehouses, all these auto parts that are taking up all these warehouses. We don't even know if anyone's ever going to want them. Anyone's ever going to need them, but we have to make them, right? Because this is the way manufacturing lines operate. So what if we stop that? What if we say, look, we're just going to wait until the part's needed, then we'll make it closer to where it's needed, right? So your sustainability, your predictability, your sourcing, it's all much smarter.
Yeah, and sustainability is, going to be one of those key issues. And that localization of production, that, use of digital print in a lot of this, short-run production, all sort of evolves around on that kind of thinking, doesn't it?
It sure does, absolutely.
Good. So, Colin, just going to your last couple of slides, I think they're quite a nice little wrap up.
Of course. So, to talk about a specific area of this new workforce or this new digital workforce, we got to, of course, address the fact that really for decades, the discussion on remote and flexible workflow was academic. People speculated that it could work, but no one really wanted to try it as, on a grand scale. What if you're wrong? What if you lose a valuable edge to a competitor? Now everyone's doing it because they have to. We live in a remote world. We live in a world that the workforce has to be able to operate wherever they are. So businesses are going remote. And I don't think this is going to change, at least not completely, even once that vaccine is created and distributed. We're not going back to business as usual. Workers enjoy the freedom of being able to have flexible workflows. And as we found, like even prior to the outbreak, and almost 2/3 of employees between, of the primary workforce, 22 to 65, they were already working occasionally. So like a day a week, a day a month, 2 days a month. But now they like this freedom. I mean, I think we can all say that we've kind of gotten used to living like this. I mean, I miss my office as much as the next person. But it's not as hard as I thought it might be. But of course, now that we have this new, and there are many advantages to the remote workflow to a remote workflow, but there are problems or there are new challenges. And chief among those are the challenge of cybersecurity, which is now going to be incredibly important. It already was incredibly important, but now it's front and center every single day with every single worker. This has to be addressed. And just go back to what we were talking about, automation. If you can't remotely operate your machinery or remotely control your workflows or your ordering processes without people on site, well, you're going to be at a real disadvantage from those companies that can.
Yeah, I think you're right. Tim, are you still with us?
Of course, yeah. I just turned off because I didn't want to take away from Colin's slide.
Did you want to add anything to this comment? Did you sense that? I mean, I think we all kind of agree, don't we, that there's a slight change in the work patterns?
Yeah, I mean, this is, I think it's critical, right? Like Colin's right. Look, a lot of this, as we've talked about, is not coming back, right? People are gotten used to working at home. I think in some cases it will be a permanent situation. And I think it's starting to materialize already, right? Like just last week, HP launched these new large format printers. They're large format printers basically designed to be in people's homes, right? Mm-hmm. Because these are, there's a security element, just to go along with what Colin talked about, the security element. There's ease of use elements, like click software they have. So I think companies, manufacturers are starting to say, look, this is definitely the way it's going. It's also the way people have been wanting it to go in some cases. Yep. So definitely remote workforce, addressing the remote workforce is an imperative for equipment manufacturers.
Mm-hmm.
Good one. Colin, last couple of slides.
Of course. So I guess what we want to end on is that, like, the beginning of this presentation was very much a downer. We're talking about consolidation. We're talking about a long-term recovery that's never going to quite be exactly where it was, even pre-COVID. So it's important, I think, to end on a high note, which is to talk about the innovation and opportunity that's still very, very present in the print industry. Um, as we mentioned before, the companies that have that diversity are maybe better suited to start exploring new things because they're not so dependent on, just say serving the hospitality and leisure industry, which not going great right now. But there's even more new opportunities than just new products. And we're seeing this with a lot of data that we're collecting, data that other people are doing. And it's the stress and anxiety of a digital world. I mean, 2020 has been an unusual year, to say the least. And people are more dialed in, we're dialed in on our computers more than we've ever been, just to get that face-to-face. But it's kind of showing that people want something more. They want to be able to disconnect. They want like that physical connection that's more than just a Zoom screen or more than just, a Skype, web chat, whatever. They want to get away and but they want to still feel close to other people at the same time. I mean, it's one of the reasons that direct mail is seeing a bit of an interesting resurgence during COVID is people like getting mail again. They really appreciate getting mail from somebody else. So print can be seen as a relaxer and an escape from the digital. Even as cybersecurity becomes more prevalent, that's going to be more stress. People are going to want to disconnect even more, I think, in their leisure time. So innovative print products can help fill that void. In addition, just help occupy new spaces. So a couple of the pictures I took here is out in the West Coast for the Oakland A's, they're printing out fans for their baseball games.
Yeah.
So it's just a cardboard cutout applied in a completely new way. To continue on with the kind of the packaging, Nintendo is gamifying cardboard, which at a time when parents Tim was saying, packaging and shipping, Amazon, all these companies, that's on the rise. So people have all this cardboard in their house. And, companies like Nintendo are like, well, you can play with this. You can use this as a game. This is something to keep around. And, especially as augmented reality comes in, we might see more potential for physical and digital to blend in new and exciting ways that really just wasn't possible before. But really, a big thing to keep in mind during this is that there will be short-term innovation and long-term innovation. Yep. So kind of what we talked about initially, that's all longer-term innovation, or most of it. The cardboard fans, no, they'll be replaced by normal fans once this ends. Ditto with masks and barriers and all of that probably won't last too much longer than the vaccine and the mass dispersal and moving on. But is that we're not going back to normal. We're not going back to pre-COVID. This is the start of a new normal. And a lot of these innovations that we're making, or that print companies are making, will go beyond the pandemic and really help shape what the industry looks like for the years to come.
Yeah. Tim, did you want to add anything to this?
Well, just, I agree. You clearly see applications that companies are creating. There's one, a company who's made this, people have offered these hand sanitizer stations for a while, right? Yeah. But a company that we're familiar with does this hand sanitizer station. It's like a branded product. So in terms of like the square footage of what they sell, it probably shouldn't amount to more than like $40 or $50 American dollars, to be honest. But they package the whole thing up like it's in a frame on a stand with branded graphics. Instead of it being like a $40 or $50 graphic, they sell it like a couple $100 per piece, right? And it's got the hand sanitizer. So it's a nice. And then I can see situations where certain of these things, like, we're not going to go backwards, right? Like, sort of like with ATMs and banks, right? And once upon a time, you had to wait until banking hours were open, and then you went to the bank, right? Now, anywhere you want, basically there's a teller machine wherever you want to go, right? So you could think about, I think in some ways, some situations like this one, like hand sanitizer, masks, anyone who's been to Japan, they wear masks all the time there, right? So if you're traveling on the trains, at least half the people are walking around wearing a mask. Is that going to be the way it is in the United States? Maybe, probably not, because we don't take trains the same way. But for sure, I think some of this stuff will sustain. And some of these, as we've talked about now, the companies who are really innovative and clever are figuring out ways to drive business even in this through this crisis.
Can I just ask you both before we finish and wrap up? Two things that kind of going through my mind. There's a sense that both of you have mentioned sustainability as something, and both of you have hinted that some projects that are sort of ongoing projects have not changed just because of COVID. Do you sense this in the print industry, in the print space? Do you understand what I mean by that? That sort of these are things that were going to happen anyway. And this,
Yeah.
What do you think?
Do you mind, if you don't mind? So Fraser, I mean,
we can't see you. Can you come back on?
Sorry. Yeah, sure. Let me hit my record. Yeah. So we've talked about, in the large format business, we've talked about commoditization for a while, right? Like the poster, banner, sign business has been commoditized in some ways for quite a while. And there's these, and so if you weren't thinking about a new way of doing business, if you hadn't been thinking about that for a while, this kind of accelerates that, right? You have to start thinking about how to identify, or I should say, what did we say? Sort of reinvent yourself, right? Mm-hmm. In some ways, this kind of exacerbates the need to do that. As you do that, you have to think about what companies really want, right? And in our research, we did the study last year. Like 80% of the shop PSPs that we interviewed said we're seeing growing demand for sustainable product, right? So now we deliberately leave that blank because what does sustainability mean? It could mean you shift from this substrate to that substrate, from this ink set to that ink set. I don't know what ultimately what's perfectly sustainable, but unquestionably people are starting to say, yeah, sustainability is on my checklist. It has to be part of the thing, right? You got to meet my cost. You got to meet my quality. You got to be sustainable, right? Whatever that means to me, that means, it reduces my disposal costs or what have you, whatever the advantages are. So those two things are definitely true. And in this case, because people are starting to rethink supply chains, sustainability is definitely part of what they're thinking about.
Colin?
Yeah, no, I very much agree with what Tim said. And to talk about, I guess, larger trends that, have existed before, like the move to digital print in the production space, it was around before COVID. It's going to be, it's continuing. It's just an example of something that this was happening already. Is the pandemic accelerating it? Yeah, to an extent, but it's just part of a greater movement that's going on. To tie things more into sustainability, I see, as Tim, there's many definitions for what sustainability means and what an eco-friendly product is. But especially coming out of the pandemic and in a year with, incredible fire devastation that's potentially tied to climate change, we're going to see that being more and more, first on the consumer side and then just for businesses that want to be seen as eco-friendly and prioritizing sustainability. They're going to invest in this. I actually wonder, and this is too far off, but part of me wonders if this is going to create an opportunity for print in the way to maybe replace plastic in a way that's biodegradable, in a way that, it doesn't hang around and pollute our oceans. I think there is tremendous opportunity there to bring back this idea of disposable doesn't mean polluting. If you have a product that is all natural, that's not made with harsh chemicals, then you can throw it away and it will just go back to nature and not be nearly as problematic as all the plastic straws and plastic cups and everything else that's going around. Will this actually materialize? I don't know. It's too far out to say, but I do. To talk about that greater trend of sustainability, I think that's only, we're not maybe as focused on it right now because of COVID and there's just other issues, but it's all connected and it's all just going to keep moving.
Gents, I think we could carry on with that conversation. I asked you just at the end just to see what you felt. I think we all feel that it's not going away, that subject, so that's interesting. Gents, thank you very much for your time. That kind of wraps up the conversation. I hope people have found it interesting. We've covered a few things that were in there that I certainly hadn't thought of. So, I think if people are just getting one or two little ideas from that, that's really useful. So, Tim, Colin, thank you both very much for joining me today.